The stages of listening to Boise State Public Radio podcasts. Step 1, testing the waters. You tune into an episode or two. Nothing too serious. Step 2, you got a little hooked on one of those series like Extremely American or Scandalized, and now you're binging. No judgment, but you did listen to it in one day. Step 3, now you're subscribed to a feed. You get notifications to your phone every time there's a new daily episode of The Connector or Idaho Matters. I see where this is going. Step 4, you realize how much time you're spending with Boise State Public Radio podcasts and the fact that it doesn't cost you a dime. Step 5, you decide to step up and support your podcast listening because you can, because you want to, not because you have to. All right, now's the time, you podcast fan you. Go to boisestatepublicradio.org and click donate to support your love of Boise State Public Radio podcast listening today.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Throughout the past year, Idaho Matters took a deep dive into how our changing climate is impacting our health. We took a look at plastics and plastic pollution. Plastics are everywhere, but what do the toxins in plastics actually do to our bodies? And how can we reduce them in the landfill? Well, these were all questions that we wanted to explore this year. So we've gathered those conversations together in our series, How We're Adapting to a Changing Climate. So join us as we answer this question and find out ways to make positive change to our health and to our planet. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. When it comes to addressing environmental issues, plastic pollution is one of the worst. In fact, according to a 2021 report from the Last Beach Cleanup and Beyond Plastics, more than 90% of the United States plastic waste ended up in a landfill, an ocean, or an incinerator. And as the pollution from single-use plastics continues to rise, the problem isn't getting any smaller. This is why Dr. Ruth J.B. will be taking a look at how the U.S. and other countries are responding to the crisis. I want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much, Gemma. Thanks for having me.
So can you just talk to us a little bit about truly how big is the plastic problem around the world?
Oh, it's enormous, and it has multiple different aspects, Gemma. I think that's what's so challenging about it. We tend to think of an environmental problem just on the basis of what exists right now, but of course we produce tons of plastic every single year, and in fact, plastic production is increasing. So we're making more plastic and making more plastic stuff, even as we sort of don't know how to get rid of and how to deal with the plastic that we already have. So all countries are experiencing issues with plastic, but certainly if you're in a developed economy where so much of our lifestyle depends on stuff that is plastic or has plastic in it, the problems are escalating all the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so can we talk a little bit more about that? Because I just think about my own plastic use in my own house, and I'm aware of the problem, and I try to reduce my plastic use. But I mean, I think about things like just washing my hair today, for example. My shampoo and conditioner comes in plastic containers, and that's just one example. We have glass bowls that we use to put, food leftovers and all of that. We made that switch years ago. However, I do still have like some plastic containers because I don't want to send glass to school in my kids' lunch, right? So I'm just thinking about my plastic bags for the garbage. I mean, I'm literally thinking of my own plastics use, and it's probably bigger than I think it is. So so what do we do as consumers, I guess?
I think your puzzlement over this is not is not uncommon. Once you really start to unpack your own lifestyle, and part of it is like look in your recycling container and look at how much of it is plastic. But even beyond that, if you wear eyeglasses, you've got plastic. If you wear contact lenses, our clothing, if you wear polyester clothing, that's got plastic in it. So plastic has become so deeply embedded in our lifestyles that it can become really challenging to figure out where's that loose thread in my lifestyle that I can start to pull. I think one of the other things that happens is dealing with plastic waste is really part of a very kind of large system. And there are some things that consumers can do. Recycle what you can recycle, eliminate plastic when you can eliminate it, sort of, take your reusable bags to the grocery store, do what you can do. But I think the reality of it is that consumer behavior cannot solve this whole problem, because by the time plastic gets to you, there are so many of those impacts already embedded in it. You can't undo all of that yourself. So it's going to take something more than just people throwing more stuff into the blue recycling bin to really adequately deal with the issues.
Okay, I really appreciate you saying that it's not consumers that can just fix the problem, because a lot of times it feels as if, we are like the consumers are the problem. That's how we feel, and there's guilt over that.
And I was going to say, it's like, there obviously are some players in the plastic story that would love for consumers to feel really guilty about their plastic use and kind of take the whole weight of this on their shoulders. I think that's absolutely not accurate. So, to your listeners, don't feel guilty because you aren't the ones who are creating this problem. There's some stuff you can do, but there are other players that have to do stuff as well.
Okay, so with that said, let's talk history here. Because you have looked at how fast the use of plastics has grown just since 1950. If you can kind of explain that history to us, but then also, is it a fair statement to say that this has been an explosive growth of plastics use?
Absolutely, it is. So, people, and this is mostly chemists, started messing around with playing with these different polymers, which are just chemicals. They're strings of chemicals. That's what plastic is made out of. And they're all distilled from oil. So the problem starts with the raw material here, which is it's made out of oil. But we started messing around with that in the early part of the 20th century. And then post World War II into the 50s, the chemists started to really get the chemistry down and to figure out how can we stabilize those strings of polymers, how can we commercialize them. And so you're absolutely right, I think, in characterizing this as explosive. The use of plastic, if you look at it on a graph, just goes it just skyrockets in about the mid to late 1950s. And of course, once we've got good at making different kinds of plastics, we started to see more and more ways that we could use them. So it's not just food containers and it's not just plastic bags. It's your contact lenses, it's clothing, it's your backpacks, it's your Barbie dolls, it's in almost everything. It's in insulation in houses. So we actually got incredibly inventive at thinking about how to leverage plastic for a whole variety of different uses. And that has a lot of what has led to the escalation in the use of plastic. It's actually a material that's good at doing a lot of things. And we took that ball and just ran with it.
So when plastic was invented, what was the hope or the goal of plastic?
I'm not sure that the inventors, that's such a great question, really sort of had a specific idea in mind, but I'm going to guess that the early chemists, so if you think about what is plastic really good at? Well, number one, it lasts a long time. It doesn't degrade very quickly. Number two, it's really lightweight. And so if you think about those two functionalities, you can see the whole variety of different ways to actually use plastic. So think about as a food container, for example. It's awesome as a food container because the food doesn't usually interact with the plastic. It keeps it really nice and fresh. It does a great job. If you think about how lightweight plastic is, that's why it's used in cars, for example, in automobiles. It makes them lighter. It makes them more fuel efficient. So I think the early originators of plastic started to see those characteristics and then carried that forward to, well, where are the ways in our lives that we actually want those things? We want to keep things fresh. We want to make things lighter. We want things to last longer. So plastic has some properties that are so positive that I think it wasn't very challenging to figure out how to use it.
So then it seems that, so here we are in the 1950s, and then in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, people were using plastic. There was, I don't remember conversations when I was a kid about plastic. But it seemed to be about the mid to late 90s when all of a sudden we started hearing conversations about some concerns around plastic. And does this go back to this discovery of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? And first, can you tell us what that is? But is that kind of what started this conversation?
I think that's what really brought it into the public's mind. There actually had been environmental activists in the mid to late 1970s who started to look at the condition of the ocean and tried to bring this to the forefront. But I think it was the discovery of what's called now the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is just this huge we think of it as a floating island. It's actually not like an island, but it is this large accumulation of plastic in the Pacific Ocean. And the plastic there's largely been brought together by ocean currents and waves and things like that have just created this huge kind of patch. And once sailors found that in the 1970s, and a journalist started to actually write about it and publicize it, publish pictures of it, I think that really brought the issue of plastic waste and plastic pollution to the forefront of the public's mind. And I think it really started to cause some people to think about plastic as a key environmental issue.
So I want to talk a little bit more now about the United States and other countries. And this goes to the fact that we have historically for years dumped our plastic trash in China. So then China stopped importing all of that waste. So first off, when did that stop? But then what was the impact, the effect of plastic waste worldwide once China said, no more?
It's such a great question. It's such a complex phenomenon, Gemma, but I think it is the key to what's happening in most of the way that the world looks at plastic now. So the change in China's trade policies actually came in about 2017 and 2018. And they had really decided, listen, we've kind of, imported enough of your plastic garbage over the years. We don't want it anymore. And China had been the single largest importer of plastic waste from all countries all over the world up to that point. So, Of course, imagine the ripple effect of them saying we aren't going to take in anymore. And what that meant for countries like the United States and for a lot of European countries is that we had to figure out what to do with all of that plastic stuff. Now, we couldn't just put it on a ship and send it to China. And we'd really outsourced our plastic waste because it was less expensive than developing our own domestic recycling infrastructure, for example. So what really happened, Gemma, is we've got all this plastic waste now that can't get shipped to China. Cities are trying to figure out, what do I do with all this stuff that I'm collecting through my recycling programs? I don't have a recycling plant to actually do anything with it, because what we called recyclers in the United States were really just sort of through passes to get stuff to China. So cities started to burn the plastic waste in an incinerator or buried in a landfill. And it was largely because we had no incentive to actually develop real recycling infrastructure in this country as long as we could ship stuff off to China.
What was China doing with all the plastics that was being shipped their way?
So China was really using the plastic in a couple of different ways. China started to take plastic in as they were trying to build their own manufacturing and their own industrial sort of economy. And so they needed raw materials. You need raw materials to make stuff, to manufacture stuff. And they developed processes to actually use the plastic that was getting sent into the country to integrate it into its own products and to integrate it into its own manufacturing. But by the mid 2010s or so, China had figured out how to generate its own raw materials. So it didn't need to import that plastic from other countries. It could supply its own raw material needs.
So you mentioned how now, cities all across the world and countries are trying to figure out what to do with their plastics, right? Because they didn't build this infrastructure. And
Right.
and we've seen this right here in Idaho, in Boise in
Yep.
particular. Like a few years back, it was all of a sudden like we're going to add this element of recycling. We're going to give you these orange bags, and you put certain plastics in this orange bag, put it on top of your recycling, and then that orange bag is going to be taken to Utah, where they're going to be able to, I don't know if they were incinerating it, but they have a recycling area for it. That never got up and running because there were issues with the recycling process. So is this something? And I mean, I'm definitely abbreviating that whole story, but I mean that's basically the gist of it.
Yep.
Is that what a lot of cities, not just in the U.S. but across the world, are running into? Is this lack of infrastructure to be able to handle plastic waste?
Yeah, so part of it is the lack of infrastructure because, again, recycling is a physical process, right? So if you haven't actually built the facilities to do the physical remake of plastic, then you aren't going to be able to recycle it. So there is that part of it. But another really important part of it, I think, Gemma, is the economics of recycling. So this is another place where I think what consumers know and what the industry knows are two completely different things. Before I started doing this research, I had this picture in my head of recycling that was kind of like a big fondue pot, and you just threw all your plastics into it, and they kind of melted it down, and they just made some new plastic stuff out of it. And that seemed like a pretty simple process, but that is not how plastic recycling works at all. So your listeners might be aware of the Chasing Symbols logo, right? That little triangular logo with that number in it, number 1, number 2. And I think most consumers think that that chasing arrow symbol means something is recyclable. In fact, it doesn't mean that at all. There are multitudes, hundreds and thousands of different types of plastic. They're all different chemical formulas. And all of those different types of plastic have to be recycled separately. So the plastic number 1s have to be separated from the number 2s, from the number 3s, from the number 4s, because you can't just melt it all down together. And that makes the economics of recycling really complicated because once you start to have to sort stuff into different piles, there are labor costs. Someone has to physically do that. But it also means that you're going to end up with smaller piles of stuff to actually reuse. And that means you've incurred costs without having the right volume of plastic to make new stuff out of it. So one of the challenges we have is that we have so many different kinds of plastic that it starts to undercut the value of recycling by making it more expensive to do it.
Okay, so with that said, then, it doesn't seem to me that if that's the case, anything will change unless we have maybe laws surrounding what we, how we recycle or this entire industry. And I know that you've looked at the laws that states and the federal government have considered when it comes to plastic waste. So is there any consensus on who should be responsible for regulating this issue? And I guess top down, does the plastics industry even want this stuff to be recycled?
That's two really interesting questions. So let me start with the industry question first. I think there's some evidence that the plastic industry is really playing kind of both sides of this game. Let's put it that way. The plastics industry wants to keep making plastic because that's how they make their money. But they have done some investment in owning recycling facilities. Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily want more recycling, but it does mean that they're getting revenue coming from both sides of this waste stream, right? They're getting it from making the plastic and then they're getting it from recycling the plastic. So in some ways, they may not care that much. I think the other question is, what do we do to actually try to change this system? Because this is a system with lots of different pieces and it's really complex and it's global. You can't regulate plastic effectively on a country by country basis because the supply chains are all global. So one of the things that's being talked about now at the UN is actually sponsoring negotiations to try to come up with a global plastics treaty. And one of the measures that some countries are advocating is that we need to simplify the number of plastics that we have. We need to come down to sort of a core, much smaller number of plastic formulas so that we don't have this economic problem with recycling. And we would decide on what those are globally, so that again, a plastic that's made in one country could be recycled in another country without having to move plastic around a lot. So there is some movement to try to simplify the world of plastic and make it easier to both physically and economically do the recycling.
So it would seem then that in order for this to be successful, what you just laid out, what the UN is doing, is maybe the only way that we see progress in plastics waste.
I think that is kind of my view. I think it's incredibly difficult to try to continue to regulate this on a country by country by country level. Because if I'm making a plastic off a certain formula in the United States, but I'm shipping that product to Canada, and their recycling system can't even recognize that formula, that just creates again, a problem, a situation where we'll never get out of this sort of endless cycle of waste. So I think there has to be some global regulation at the global level, simply because we move plastic around through global supply chains and global trade chains. And so we've got to regulate it at that level.
So then it goes back to this idea that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation today, where there is this messaging going on that it's the consumer's problem. It's the consumer's fault. We are the problem. We are using too much plastic, right? We are being wasteful and we don't care about the earth, right? And so you need to recycle and you need to use less plastic. But it seems to me that what you've just laid out for us is the problem truly is bigger than any one of us. And so it seems that we, and we meaning the world, global leaders, need to figure out a way to reduce what we produce.
And it's really, I think that's a really good point. There is a group of countries at these UN negotiations that are saying, listen, the plastic problem starts at the point where we produce plastic. And we've got to look at actually capping our production of plastic. And that means we have to look at developing substitute materials, but they really go back to square one. This is also a group of countries that recognizes there's a link between the production of plastic and climate change. Plastic is made out of oil. So all of the problems that we have with fossil fuels, again, are part of the plastic problem and get embedded in plastic. And for those reasons, they say, listen, we have to start to cap production and start to move ourselves to different types of materials. As you can imagine, there are countries that disagree pretty vehemently with that position, but I think it's a conversation that consumers need to be aware of too, that plastics problems are really deeply embedded in the material itself, and just trying to recycle is never going to undo all of those problems.
So, bottom line for you, where should the bulk of change come from?
So I really am a believer that we are past the point where voluntary activity is going to effectively deal with our plastic problem. It just isn't. And I also don't think that, local or state regulation is going to be enough to deal with the problem either. So I have really become kind of firmly convinced that we need this global treaty, whatever its provisions are, to actually try to incentivize countries to confront the realities of plastic as part of our lifestyle and make the really sort of deep and broad changes that need to be made. So I would say, consumers, keep recycling what you can recycle, but if you really are concerned about this issue, get on the phone or get on the horn to your legislators and push them to push the United States to become serious about these global negotiations. I think that is where our effort needs to go.
I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I have to say, I've learned a lot and I really appreciate this perspective. So thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Great. Thank you very much, Gemma. Happy to talk with you.
Plastics play a huge role in our daily lives, but what kind of impact do the chemicals in plastics actually have on our health? Let's get back to our series, How We're Adapting to a Changing Climate, right here on Idaho Matters. More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. Think back to the last time you were in a hospital. How much plastic did you see? Doctors and nurses use a lot of plastic. Syringes, for example, which are only used once, come in a plastic sleeve, which is thrown away. Hospitals produce 14,000 tons of trash every single day, and up to a quarter of that is plastic. And those plastics are going into our bodies, even our brains, along with into the environment. Dr. Hilary Ong is an assistant professor of pediatrics and emergency medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and she's on a mission to reduce plastic in hospitals. She's joining us today along with Dr. Matthew Campen, a professor at the University of New Mexico's College of Pharmacy. I want to welcome both of you to the program.
Thank you, Gemma, for having us.
Dr. Ong, let me start with you. How did you get started trying to reduce the use of plastics in hospitals?
Well, thank you for that question, Gemma. And again, I appreciate you having us on your show to talk about a topic of plastic pollution that I'm deeply concerned about. To answer your question, it's really through my healthcare sustainability work in the hospital and my reading of the medical literature and other reports that I became very alarmed over the past few years of the extent of our plastic pollution and its associated health harms. And as a pediatrician and mom myself, I've been advocating and educating colleagues and the public of the health harm of plastics and really focusing on my sphere of influence in the hospital to reduce healthcare's plastic reliance.
So, Dr. Ong, how much plastic do you use every day in your work? I mean, I mentioned in the introduction, plastic syringes, but what else do you see on a daily basis?
I come in contact with a lot of plastic products, and those numbers that you quoted are in fact alarming. In that sort of equates to about 7 million pounds of plastic a day. Sort of doing that calculation of that 14,000 tons, and a quarter of that is plastic waste. I work in the pediatric emergency room, and I come across with a lot of single-use plastics, and I think healthcare now has a deep reliance on plastic medical products, and it has revolutionized healthcare, and it has played an important role in the packaging and personal protective equipment, masks and gowns that you mentioned, the syringes. But I do believe we have come to a point where we are sort of tipped over and relying too heavily on plastics as we understand more and more the health harms of plastics, from microplastics to toxic chemicals like phthalates and BPA. Just to give an example, in the emergency room, I use custom procedural trays like a laceration repair tray, and that comes with tons of plastics, from the plastic wrapping to the plastic trays and the plastic syringes you mentioned, and everything is single use, and I just toss in the trash. And that sort of goes in circles from disposal in our medical waste streams and out in the environment, and which lands up in our food systems and our water systems, et cetera.
So, Dr. Campen, Dr. Ong mentioned microplastics. Can we talk a little bit more about that? What are microplastics, and really how harmful are they?
Sure. So the microplastics are essentially the same thing as regular plastics, but when we throw these things away, like Dr. Ong talked about, they get old and brittle and worn, and they break down in the environment, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. They never stop becoming polymers. They just become smaller, and eventually they become micro, and we even now see nanoplastics that are smaller than a micrometer in diameter. And these things get through the soils, they get into our foods, they get into our bodies fairly readily is what we're discovering now.
So, Dr. Campen, you did a study that found a growing level of microplastics in placentas. Can you talk to us more about that?
Sure. We've been studying a number of different human specimens in order to get a good handle on how much is in the human body, and therefore to help us model what could be the current and future health concerns related to this. And so we started with human placentas, which is a tissue most often discarded and readily available to us. And what we found was that there was around 100 micrograms per gram of plastics in those placentas, which may not seem like a lot, but we also found that in some placentas, it could be 6, 7, 8 times that much. So then we've subsequently looked at other parts from autopsy specimens, and it's shown that the placentas are actually quite low compared to, say, kidney, liver, and even the brain, which is by far the highest thing we've measured to date.
Okay, so talk about this, the brain itself, because you say the average brain has like 7 grams of plastic in it. So just for people to understand that, that's about 1.5 of a plastic spoon.
Right. It's pretty alarming, our numbers so far. The plastic particles are throughout the brain. We're starting to get a handle on where they're located and why they get there. They seem to be slightly larger than plastics we find in other places, so maybe twice the size of the plastics we find in liver or kidney. Um, we're not really sure how they get there because we think of the blood-brain barrier as being protective, but we suspect that these may be hijacking their way into the body as they associate with the lipids, the fats that we
Hmm.
eat, and they get taken up that way, and the brain loves those fats for energy. And if you've ever tried to wash a Tupperware bowl that has bacon grease in it, you know that's going to
Mm-hmm.
take a lot of soap. Plastics and lipids and fats go together like, peanut butter and jelly.
So, Dr. Campen, there's also a study out that shows high levels of microplastics in human testicles. I want to bring this up because this led you to start wondering if that might be part of a reason why sperm counts have been dropping around the world. Can you talk a little about that?
It's a big question. For 50 years, for my lifetime, we've watched global trends of decreasing sperm count. Nobody has a really good idea as to why. And the only obvious thing is these plastics and the plastic chemicals associated with them, as Dr. Ong mentioned, the phthalates and the bisphenols and things like that. Those are increasing in our world. There have been a handful of studies in this past year that have pointed to plastics in male genitalia, and it may help
Mhm.
to explain why we do have reduced rates of sperm generation as well as erectile dysfunction may be impacted. So it's compelling, but we're still just at the tip of understanding what the impacts may be.
Mhm. So, Dr. Ong, can we talk solutions? Because a lot of this is single use plastics, like you mentioned, syringes, tubing, gloves, things like that. So, A, is there a way to reuse some of these devices? And B, how do you make sure that if you can do that, it's safe?
Thank you for that question, Gemma. But before I answer that, I just want to add to something that Dr. Camp mentioned, microplastics. And I
Hmm.
want to add that it's not just the physical weight or irritation from the plastics, but I do want to remind all our listeners also that these small particles continue to leak toxic chemicals. So is it the sort of the physical irritation from the microplastics or the chemical leakage and the reaction from that, like Dr. Kapman mentioned, we're just at the tip of the iceberg for research. In terms of solutions, I'm going to focus on sort of my area of expertise, which is in healthcare. And we do have solutions out there, and it is a matter of commitment and knowledge from the healthcare industry, medical supplies industry, government regulatory bodies, etc. So solutions, I think it's a couple-fold. Our colleagues and I have a paper out in JAMA that was published a couple months ago that talked about a framework to healthcare action and reducing plastic reliance. I think first is really refusing. So refusing to use more plastics and thinking about innovative ways to reduce our plastic reliance. We've come so far in heavily relying on plastics over the past decade or so, and thinking about what my colleague had mentioned, going back retro. So thinking about how we can switch back to more reprocessable and reusable instruments that are glass-based or steel-based and really non-plastic-based, as there's more and more research coming out to suggest that the IV tubing, the intravenous tubing that we use, or single-use plastic products that we use in healthcare leach microplastics and leach toxic chemicals. And as an example, in my institution, we've got rid of phthalate-based IV tubing in our neonatal ICU, which is really data-driven.
So, Dr. Campen, if we just try to stay away from plastics as much as possible, Oh, would that be enough to keep them from getting into our bodies? Or I'm assuming the problem is probably bigger than that, at least at this point.
It's pretty insidious. That's a really important point, and Dr. Ong's correct. We need to reduce using the plastic materials in our world, but it's going to take more than that. I think we need to invest more in waste management. We need to
Mm,
understand where our plastics are going, how they move through the environment, and get into the agricultural pathways, which is eventually the biggest source of plastic we eat is from livestock and from plants. So we have a big problem that touches every person on this planet right now. And I think back to some of the big environmental movements of the 1960s and 70s, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Water Act. We need those types of policy implementation changes to really make a dent in this because we need industry to follow suit. We need the government to take charge and put some real investment into this. So it's much more than what we can do as individuals.
mm. So, Dr. Campen, I mean, given really some of the alarming trends you're finding in your research, uh, should should we be alarmed about how much plastic is going into our bodies?
Yes, I want people to be alarmed, and yet I also don't want people stressing,
Okay.
because certainly we have enough stress in our lives, and cortisol is not healthy, and blood pressure needs to be maintained. That's the reality. We need to be firm. I liked Dr. Ong's language. Refusing to use plastic when offered. You don't need that straw.
Mm,
You might be able to do without that lid or that extra piece. But we also need to start talking to our politicians and our leaders. We need to engage with industry as well. I've spoken with CEOs who feel bad about the situation we're in, but they feel hamstrung because if industry goes out, like if one company goes out and starts using post-consumer recyclable material that's like 25% or whatever, it may not look good on the shelf compared to the competitor with brand new polymer on the bottle. So we need to level the playing field and make sure industry moves forward as a uniform group under a regulatory structure.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for coming in and talking with us. We've been speaking with Dr. Hilary Ong. She's an assistant professor of pediatrics and emergency medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, along with Dr. Matthew Campen, a professor at the University of New Mexico's College of Pharmacy. We've been talking about reducing plastic waste in hospitals. Plastics play a huge role in our daily lives, but what kind of impact do the chemicals in plastics actually have on our health? Let's get back to our series, How We're Adapting to a Changing Climate, right here on Idaho Matters. More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Cadet. As our cities continue to grow, so too does our need for green spaces. Areas like public parks play an important role in our communities, providing both urban and environmental benefits. These benefits, however, can be really easy to overlook. This is why environmental and urban historian Quinn Anderson will be exploring the impact of these spaces as well as how they've changed over time. Quinn, I am so happy to have you on the program.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So, for folks who may not be quite familiar with the term, tell us a little bit more about what you mean when we use that term green space.
Well, I like to think of it as a sort of deceptively simple terminology, right? I think there's this innate understanding that we have of like, what is a green space? Well, it's a space that's green, right? So a lot of people will
Mhm.
gravitate towards, parks, gardens, but it really is a lot more flexible than that, right? I mean, a cemetery, for example, is probably a perfect example, or maybe a botanical garden, right? So anywhere within a city where, greenery, biodiversity thrive, places where you might be able to take a break. I lump those all together in green spaces. So it's very broad, but I think it's for the better that it's very broad.
Mm. And I would think that these areas, these green spaces, can be pretty beneficial for our mental and physical health. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's the sort of like two halves of it, right? There's the physical health, which is a lot of these spaces, provide ample opportunities for recreation, right? The mental health is just as important. People write about what are called third spaces, spaces that are distinct from your home space, your workspace. These third spaces are sort of neutral territory for people to
Mm.
interact with their peers, get out of those two very, those other places where we spend much of our time. And there are so many studies, that come out year on year that basically demonstrate the really positive benefit that even just seeing greenery, being around greenery, getting out and outdoors have on your mental health.
Well, and then what about like urban areas, right? Like talking major cities. I mean, I think about New York City and Central Park being in the middle of that city, which when you go into Central Park, I mean, I think it's frankly almost stunning how peaceful it can be and how quiet it can be. I mean, Paris has Luxembourg Gardens and it is
Mhm.
so similar, right? It's like you have these huge green spaces in these middle of these vast just urban areas. Why is that important as well that we really look at those really big urban areas to have space like this?
I think it's important to look at those because a lot of people, I think, tend to sort of naturalize these spaces over time. Like a lot of people sort of consider a place like Central Park as like the last fragment of the New York landscape preserved
Mm.
over time and through the centuries. But in actuality, it's more of like a technology, right? Like when you say like, oh, these big cities, there's the kind of clangor and crush of urban living. When these parks get designed, especially like Central Park, and this was an express goal of Olmsted, these places are supposed to provide that reprieve, and they're designed to
Hmm.
provide that reprieve, right? You see these large tree plantings at the edge of these parks to reduce sound. The grass and all these, biotic communities that live here provide fresh air. You have these sweeping vistas that are, relaxing for the mind to perceive. So these spaces are really oftentimes designed as the antidote, because people have this idea, and especially for environmental historians, it's a rather complicated idea of nature as being the sort of antithesis and the solution to urban living, right?
Mm.
So these
Hmm.
spaces are very much like a technology in the way that they get employed in cities.
So I want to kind of talk about some of your research itself, in particular around a space like the Boise Greenbelt. When you talk about that connection between green space and urban pollution, why is something then like the Greenbelt, why does it kind of fall into that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my thesis took a look at the Greenbelt in part. And what I kept finding, especially for all the parks in Boise, not just the Greenbelt, is that
Hmm.
so many of them are remediated sites of heavy industry, right? So
Yeah.
especially for the Greenbelt, people are dumping cars, they're dumping tires, fence posts. There's offal coming out of, slaughterhouses, all kinds of nasty stuff being dumped into the river. The connection that I think people let go by the wayside is that I think these polluted spaces are oftentimes picked up as parks for two reasons. One, there's the sort of economic argument of it's the cheapest, it's cheapest land to buy. Nobody wants the river that's filled with blood
Right.
and fat, right? So it's
Yeah.
very cheap to acquire land on the other side of it. But I think also they kind of inspire looking at the city in different ways, right? It's very interesting that throughout history, and you can find this replicated in a number of cities across the world, people look at polluted spaces and they think, not only how do we get rid of this, but what can it be? And it's really telling that oftentimes the answer for what can it be is a park. We seek to find solace from this nasty pollution in this sort of beautifying nature that everyone can take part in.
So, what role do you think history plays when it comes to, designing green spaces? I mean, we talked about Central Park, right, in Olmsted, and like his vision, right? But what about future green spaces?
I think history has so much to give this because it would be very easy to have like a very technocratic approach to
Hmm.
the design of parks. And for many years, that was the idea, was sort of like, well, we're going to have these sort of very regimented spaces, especially in the sort of early 1920s. Parks were very ordered. It wouldn't be uncommon to see, a sort of band leader marshaling children for organized activities. But moving forward and understanding the history of these urban spaces, I think really allows us to recognize how we are kind of entering into a new era of park design, right? No longer are we restricted to, we need to have very passive recreation. We need to have promenades or we need to have sort of guided recreation. Now we can be a lot more flexible with what we do with our parks. And especially as we start facing, some of these really dynamic, intractable almost problems of the future, parks
Hmm.
and, what limited urban space we really can marshal is going to be super important. I think of vest pocket parks, tiny little parks, less than an acre lot that you can
Yeah.
squeeze almost into any area. Or, the number of really cool energy parks that exist around the world, like the Copenhill, which is it's a heating power plant that's also a ski hill in Copenhagen.
Oh,
Or even
wow.
Lucky Peak. It's
Hmm.
a state park, but it also has an actual power plant built onto that campus as well.
Well, thank you so much for making time for us to chat about this. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we've been speaking with environmental and urban historian Quinn Anderson, talking about the impact of urban parks and green spaces and how they've changed over time. You've been listening to our series, How We're Adapting to a Changing Climate, where we've been exploring how our climate is changing and how it's affecting our bodies and our health. You can see all our stories on climate and our health on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.